Hi everyone, and welcome to Serendipity. My name is Saren and I'm your host, and you're listening to a podcast that has been missing for about 3 months. But nevertheless, we're back and ready to get into it. This is a podcast where through, let me remind you, discussion, questioning, and confronting, we look at the constructs of our world and in the end create our own serendipity. So let me not even waste time. I've been gone for 3 months because I was changing platforms. It was supposed to take 1 week, it took 2, then a month, then 2 months, now we're at 3 months, but I don't even want to talk about it. Let's just get into today's episode. So I'm excited to talk about this. Today we're talking about pretty privilege. Is it real? If it's real, why does it matter? And how do we liberate ourselves from these ideas of beauty and beauty politics? So that being said, I'm ready to get into it, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey y'all, so before I even get into this video, I did want to give a disclaimer because I didn't even acknowledge like my privileges in the way that I might benefit from pretty privilege, which I definitely believe I do. And some of the things that I talk about in this video are going to be so much easier said than done. So I want to make sure I acknowledge that there are some ways that I definitely benefit from the rules of desirability politics, which you'll learn about later. But I hope you enjoy this episode and I hope it's fun. Well, pretty privilege is an interesting thing because it's not a term that you would normally hear. Like, the first time I heard pretty privilege was probably during the summer, during like the George Floyd uprisings. And I was actually like, interesting, that makes sense. Like, someone who is pretty has some type of privilege, some type of access to something. So let me just start by defining it. It is a person who has more opportunities and becomes more successful because of how attractive they are. Obviously, that definition is really broad in my perspective. So we're saying that people who are attractive have more access to things because they are pretty. And 2 weeks ago, before I researched any of this, I would have been like, yeah, definitely, makes sense, simple. But I do have reasons why I question this, and I'm going to get into them in a second. But first, I wanted to talk about other people's perspectives because I wanted to understand what other people think about pretty privilege before I even talk about it. And so I ended up doing a poll on my Instagram, and I asked, firstly, do you believe pretty privilege exists? And if you do you believe you benefit from it or not? And the answers were interesting. Pretty much everyone said that they believe pretty privilege exists, but more people said they believe it exists and they don't benefit from it than people who said they believe it exists and they do benefit from it. But there was still a sizable amount of people who said pretty privilege exists and they benefit from it. I also asked why they believe this, and the responses were really interesting. So firstly, one of the responses that I got a lot was why people didn't experience pretty privilege. And what they would say is that because they are Black, or because they're fat, or just certain things that usually had to do with some type of structural violence, so anti-Blackness, fatphobia, transphobia, anti-queerness was said a lot when people described why they didn't have pretty privilege. There was also the people who said that they did, and they would explain that they have pretty privilege because, again, light skin, maybe curly hair, like when people were describing why they would benefit from it, it largely has something to do with some sort of structural violence. Next, what was interesting was why people believe pretty privilege exists. Overall, there was just this clear consensus that if you're prettier and more attractive, people might reach out to you more, people like you more, people treat you better. And other people would bring it into, of course, the beauty standards, the structures, Eurocentric beauty, being fat, being whatever. A lot of people pointed to the fact that just naturally people are more likely to treat people who they are attracted to with respect and therefore love. And that being said, for the people who benefited from it, it might be that people would approach them, people would be nicer to them, people would like them more, but just in general that people were nicer to the people that they saw were beautiful. And that was a consensus all around. The last thing that's really interesting to me is the reason why people thought it was so important to acknowledge this, and a lot of people really reiterated they believe people don't acknowledge that pretty privilege is real. In general, they were calling out this habit of people to not acknowledge pretty privilege. So that's the consensus of people on my Instagram. So if you participated in that, thank you. But I thought that was so interesting because honestly, I was with them. If I had made this episode maybe like 2 months, 3 months, 4 months ago, it would have been like, yeah, 100% pretty privilege exists. Now I'm on the fence, and here's the reason why. So the first thing has to do with just overall the meaning of pretty privilege. When we talk about privilege, normally I view privilege to be something that is holistic, right? Something that is universal. So I know who is white and I know who is rich, so I can say white privilege exists because universally all white people experience it, and class privilege exists because all rich people experience it, so it's universal. But when it comes to pretty privilege, there's this there's this undertone that the attractiveness is subjective. So it depends on person to person. So that being said, is that really something that I would say is a societal structure? I don't know. My problem with pretty privilege is not that it doesn't exist per se. I think it's more so that it doesn't address the root of the problem that people are talking about. As I pointed out in my Instagram, a lot of people who said pretty privilege existed pointed to what features and what factors would make someone be treated better because they're pretty. And a lot of things people would say was people who are darker skinned, people who are fat, people who are queer, people who are trans, all these different identities are people who would be seen as less desirable and therefore they would not be experiencing pretty privilege. And then on the other side, the people who do experience pretty privilege were more so people who fit into the European structure of beauty. What makes me uncomfortable about claiming that to be pretty privilege is if someone treats me less than because I have black features, then is that because I'm not pretty or is that anti-blackness? Same with the fat comment. Like if someone won't date you or won't treat you right because you are fat, is that because you're not pretty or is that because of a larger issue of fat phobia? I think the issue for me comes at when I say someone is pretty and they have privilege because they are pretty, I'm making it seem like that's something that's subjective. Attractiveness is something that isn't really structured in any specific thing. Like, if you're pretty and you experience these things. But based on the things that people are saying and based on my understanding of even the conventional beauty standards, these are all based on structural violence. So when I just say pretty privilege, I'm not getting down to the heart of the issue. My next problem comes with the fact that I think there are a lot better terms that can be used to define what we're talking about with pretty privilege. Desirability is something that goes hand in hand with the issue of attractiveness. And that's what people are pointing to when they say that, oh, I might not be treated as well by people because I'm not pretty. Also, that goes into the male gaze. I'm not going into the male gaze today. I don't feel like it. I'm not doing it. But I am going to talk about desirability politics. So the first thing I want to do is read a quote by Deshaun Harrison, and I think they do a really good job talking about what desirability politics is. Desirability politics is the methodology through which the sovereignty of those deemed conventionally attractive, beautiful, and/or arousing is determined. Put another way, the politics of desire labels that which determines who gains and holds both social and structural power through the affairs of sensuality, often predicated on anti-blackness, anti-fatness, transmisogyny, cis-sexism, queer antagonism, and all other structural violence. So the main reason I prefer desirability politics is because it names what the issue is. Like, who isn't pretty? When we just say pretty privilege, it's like, okay, well, who's pretty? Who's defined? Who's considered beautiful under this? And I think that's why we get so many people who are like, oh, well, I don't know if I believe pretty privilege exists, because who's pretty? Who do you define as that? So I think there are so many better terms that we could use other than pretty privilege, aka where it's like desirability politics. We could call it what it is, anti-blackness, fat phobia. But in general, I don't think pretty privilege does the work that we need it to do, especially if we're talking about liberating ourselves. Now, I think I can still talk about the framework of pretty privilege and why it is important through the lens of desirability politics. So I think it's important to talk about the consequences of having a world that is run on the idea of beauty. So the other day I was reading a essay and it was written by a woman named Tressie McMillan Cottom, and her essay was called In the Name of Beauty. And in that essay she really goes off. Let me just go ahead and recommend it now. Go ahead and read that book. But she talks a lot about the way that beauty and anti-blackness interact. And one of her main points is that black women specifically are naturally excluded from accessing beauty because in many ways beauty had to be predicated on having an other. So they created the European standard of beauty, which was based on the white woman, on her femininity, on her delicateness. And in order to do that, they needed an opposite. And that opposite was the black woman. She would be completely treated opposite to that. So in her talking about the issue of beauty, she goes into why she wants other people to divest from beauty completely. And one of the things she brings up is the consequences of beauty. So when we think about beauty and pretty privilege, a lot of times I think we just think about being nice to someone, like going out with someone, getting maybe a free Chipotle bowl. But the consequences far reach way more than that. And one of those things is when we talk about medical racism, school racism, and mass incarceration. So she points to the fact that, and I quote, "When beauty is white and I am dark, it means that I am more likely to be punished in school, to receive higher sentences for crime, less likely to marry someone with equal or higher economic status, and denying these empirical realities is its own kind of violence, even when our intentions are good." We're talking about a whole system that we can point to being uplifted by this idea of beauty. And she points to all those things that affect black women when we talk about black women being more susceptible to maternal mortality. Like, all of those are embedded in the issue of desirability politics. So why should we care about this issue of desirability? It's because people are dying. Essentially, people are dying, people are getting hurt. That being said, I think it's so important to acknowledge that these inequalities exist and call it what it is, and I'm going to call it desirability politics. And that means acknowledging anti-blackness, fat phobia, ableism, and how that intersects with beauty. Now, the end always has to be, how do we liberate ourselves? How do we liberate ourselves from something that is so normalized? Because it's so normal for us to look at beauty in our society. Well, first of all, we have to really define what beauty is. And what Tressie McMillan Cotton does is she defines beauty to be related to capital. Capital in the way that beauty is an asset that gains power. So when I know beauty is something that gains power, then I also have to recognize that beauty is violent and it's hurtful. In one of her quotes, she says, "When we are trapped in the race not to be complicit in our own oppression, self-definition masquerades as a notion of loving our black selves in and on white terms. However, critique that hides the power being played out in the theater of our everyday lives only serves the power. It doesn't actually challenge it." So in that quote, what she really is talking about is the ways that we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot when we try to liberate ourselves. So often when we talk about liberating ourselves from this idea of desirability politics, pretty privilege, and just the mistreatment of people who aren't seen as conventionally attractive, we like to empower ourselves using beauty politics, meaning we try to uplift the idea that we are beautiful in and of itself. We see it in the Black is Beautiful movement within the 60s and 70s around the Black Power movement, and we also see it now with the body positivity movement, which is pushing to say that all bodies are beautiful and we should all love ourselves. Well, the problem is that beauty, being capital, is grounded in institutions, and those institutions have consequences. As I pointed to some of them before, we have medical racism, we have medical fat phobia, we have the way students are treated in schools. These institutions have real and dangerous consequences. So when your preference doesn't meet what the institution sees fit, it doesn't actually affirm that, and your preference becomes minuscule in the grand scheme of things. On top of that, because you are forming beauty, while your preference is ignored, the fact that beauty is being uplifted is seen, and attempt to empower yourself is commodified and then stratified. Tressie McMillan Cottom says in another quote that our so-called counter-narratives about beauty and what they demand of us cannot be divorced from the fact that beauty is contingent upon capitalism. Even our resistance becomes means to commodify, and what is commodified is always, always stratified. This is simply no other way to put it. To coerce, beauty must exclude. She's pointing to when our empowerment is co-opted and then commodified, what happens is then again it becomes very exclusionary, because by commodifying it, you then have to decide which beauty practices are better. I think one of the biggest examples of the technique of empowerment through beauty politics that hasn't worked is in the natural hair community, in the natural hair movement. So if you don't know what the natural hair movement is, it's a movement to normalize the wearing of natural hair, of black natural hair, in any state, in any form, and doing your styles in any way you want. So a lot of black women have decided to go natural, maybe cut off your relaxer, start new, get rid of the damage. And originally this was created to show more love to the tighter and more coily hair textures. So 4C hair is known as the most coily type of hair texture. However, what ended up happening with this movement is that 4C hair got completely ignored, and the hair that ended up being uplifted was the hair that was the loosest curl, and that was the longest, and that was largely the 3C, 3A group of hair. What happened is, while we were trying to empower ourselves through this idea that all of our hair is beautiful and we should wear it just as we want and it's beautiful in any form, what ended up happening is it got commodified. And because of that, we had all these influencers, all these companies who were catering to this idea of black hair. First of all, the first issue, companies did not care. They were just creating any type of product that in some ways hurt our hair. But on the other side, you have girls with 4C hair trying to find acceptance in this movement, in this world for their hair, and they were buying all these products, trying to figure out how to show that curl pattern, and it never worked. It ended up just being that you were still ostracized, you were still judged, still compared to people like Richard Pryor, and still made fun of. So while we were trying to buy into this movement and buy into this beauty standard, we got left out, and it just didn't work. It didn't work for all women, and it just ended up creating those same structures of exclusion that were there before. So, in saying that, she's stating that we need to look at the system as it is instead of trying to empower it from within, because we just end up reinforcing it, which we should be critiquing it. How do we critique it, you ask? Well, she calls it naming the issue, naming what we are fighting against. And in doing so, that is where we get into the politics of ugly. So the person who I'm going to use for talking about the politics of ugly is Deshaun Harrison, because they do such a good job of getting into why we should embrace the idea of ugly. So one of the main things they talk about is the idea of the politics of ugly and why making ugly political is important. In this, they quote Mia Mungus, and here's the quote. "We all run from the ugly, and the farther we run from it, the more we stigmatize it and the more power we give beauty. Our communities are obsessed with being beautiful and gorgeous and hot. What would it mean if we were ugly? What would it mean if we didn't run from our own ugliness for each other's? How do we take this thing out of ugly?" So in this, what she's talking about is the way that we end up giving beauty more power than we should. So understanding that beauty is exclusive and someone is always going to be excluded from it, we understand that the power really comes from ugly people wanting to buy into beauty. And this can be understood in any type of like economic format, but say you have one product over here and everybody wants it, but there's not enough. If everyone tries to buy into that, the value goes up because there's more demand for it. But if we ignore that and just go to something else, then we can drop that demand and be good with what we have. So applying that to ugliness, if we destigmatize it and truly name it and contextualize it and use it to inform our politics, we take that power back from beauty, but at the same time, we start to really gain our own understanding of how to liberate ourselves. To understand Mia Mungus's point more, I want to go back to Tressie McMillan Cottom and how she talks about why she chooses to accept ugly. "When I say I am unattractive or ugly, I am not internalizing the dominant culture's assessment of me. I am naming what has been done to me and signaling who did it. They say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that ugly is as ugly does. Both are lies. Ugly is everything done to you in the name of beauty. Knowing the difference is part of getting free. In her understanding, she's saying that by saying that I am ugly and recognizing and acknowledging who has done it to me and the systems that are at play, you're able to firstly give context to your situation, and secondly, you're able to critique it. I can't critique something that I'm buying into. I can't critique the way beauty works if I'm buying into the idea that I need to be beautiful. So by divesting from beauty and embracing ugly, I'm able to actually critique the things that are oppressing me and liberate myself. So I thought that was a really interesting way of putting it. But I think Deshaun Harrison also had a really nice way of talking about how they use ugliness to inform their politics. They say, I want us to interrogate why we ask ugly people to apologize for our ugliness and to find ways to conform to beauty rather than divesting completely from beauty as a political concept. In that same vein, I want us to sit with why we believe insecurity as a concept must be a personal moral failing rather than a result of systemic and social domination. I want us to know insecurity as intimately as we know the marginalized pieces of our identity as valid as identities in political. In this, what they're saying is that why do we stigmatize something that is nobody's choice? It's nobody's choice to feel bad about what they look like. It's nobody's choice to be treated as if you are ugly. So that being said, why don't we divest from it and give people the actual power to understand that their value and their identity is so much more than a system that oppresses them? And I think that is such a beautiful way of putting how we need to inform our politics around beauty. Of course, my opinions on this are always changing, even on pretty privilege. Like tomorrow I might be like, yes, pretty privilege is a term that I want to use. But in the end, I think the thing that definitely stands true to me is that we need to divest from beauty. And it's so much easier said than done. Like, look at me. I literally did my makeup for this video. But I think why we need to divest from beauty, because I think we can find ways to uplift our value and uplift and empower ourselves that don't buy into a system that was created to exclude us. So that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode on Pretty Privilege. I want to hear your opinions, so make sure you DM me. I love when y'all DM me. I'm back and I'm here to stay, so make sure you subscribe and check every week because I drop an episode once a week. And yeah, I'll see y'all next week.